The crack of gunfire split the morning air as Isaac Yates sent a bullet skyward, scattering the crows that had been perching on his fence post. The year was 1876, and in the unforgiving terrain of Colorado's high country, a man had to speak the language of violence just to get nature's attention. Isaac lowered his Colt revolver, the metal still warm against his palm as he surveyed the sprawling ranch that had become both his kingdom and his prison. Whiskey River Ranch, 10 miles outside of Cripple Creek, was known throughout the territory for two things: the finest horses west of the Mississippi and the meanest son of a gun who broke them. "Ain't no horse can't be broken," Isaac muttered to himself, returning the gun to its holster. "Just ain't met the right man yet." His calloused hands, scarred from years of rope burns and wild stallions, tightened around the top rail of the corral fence as he watched his newest acquisition, a magnificent black stallion with eyes like burning coals, circle nervously inside. At 32, Isaac's reputation had grown as wild as the horses he tamed. Tall and lean, with eyes the color of a winter storm and a face weathered by sun and wind, he wore his dark hair longer than most men, tying it back when he worked. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline told a story he never shared, and few were brave enough to ask. "Boss," the voice of his ranch hand, Tom Cooper, interrupted his thoughts. "Stage is coming in. Looks like we got company." Isaac's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't expecting visitors, and in his experience, unexpected guests brought nothing but trouble. "Who is it?" he growled, not taking his eyes off the stallion. "Don't know," Tom replied, shifting his weight nervously. Everyone on the ranch knew Isaac's moods, and this morning's disposition was already stormy. "Fancy carriage, though. City folks, I reckon." Isaac spat into the dirt. "I ain't got time for city folks and their delicate sensibilities. Tell him I'm busy." "It's a lady, boss. And she's asking for you by name." This finally drew Isaac's attention away from the horse. His steel-gray eyes narrowed suspiciously. "A lady? What business would a lady have with me?" Before Tom could answer, the sound of approaching wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves announced the arrival of the carriage. Isaac reluctantly turned toward the main house, his spurs jingling with each determined stride. The carriage that pulled up to the hitching post was indeed fancy polished wood with brass fittings that gleamed in the morning sun. The driver, a young man who looked uncomfortable in the rugged surroundings, hopped down to open the door. Isaac stopped several yards away, one hand resting instinctively near his holster, watching as a woman emerged from the carriage. Faith Fairchild stepped onto the hard-packed earth of Whiskey River Ranch with as much dignity as she could muster after 3 days of jolting travel. At 26, she had learned to carry herself with a quiet confidence that belied her inner turmoil. Her honey-blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and her traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, was well-tailored and spoke of Eastern refinement. Her clear blue eyes took in the ranch, the corrals, and finally settled on the imposing figure watching her with undisguised wariness. So this was the notorious Isaac, Yates, the man her late father had described in his letters as the finest horseman in the West, and the most disagreeable human being this side of Hades. "Mr. Yates," she called, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "I'm Faith Fairchild." Samuel Fairchild's daughter. Isaac's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Samuel Fairchild. "Samuel's dead," he stated flatly. Faith nodded, removing her gloves. "Yes, 3 months ago. That's why I'm here." "My condolences," Isaac replied, though the words held no warmth. "But that don't explain what business brings you to my ranch." Faith lifted her chin slightly. My father's business is now my business, Mr. Yates, and according to his papers, he was a silent partner in this ranch, which makes me a partner now. The silence that followed her declaration was so profound that even the birds seemed to stop their singing. The ranch hands who had gathered to watch the exchange glanced nervously at one another, then at their boss, whose face had gone as still as stone. "That's a damn lie," Isaac finally said, his voice dangerously low. "This ranch is mine. Every stick, stone, and blade of grass. I don't have partners, silent or otherwise." "I have the documentation to prove it," Faith replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "My father invested a considerable sum 5 years ago when you were expanding. The agreement was that he would remain a silent partner, taking a percentage of profits while you maintained full operational control." Isaac's jaw clenched. He remembered that investment all too well. It had come at a time when he'd been desperate to secure enough land for the ranch to be viable, when banks wouldn't lend to a man with his reputation. But Samuel had been clear that it was a loan, not a partnership. "Whatever papers you think you have, they're wrong," Isaac insisted. "Your father loaned me money. I paid him back with interest. We're square." Faith shook her head. "The loan was converted to an ownership stake. It's all documented, Mr. Yates. I've brought everything with me." Isaac took a menacing step forward, but Faith stood her ground. "I don't care what papers you've got. This is my ranch. I built it from nothing, and no city woman with fancy ideas is going to waltz in and claim otherwise." "I have no intention of interfering with your operation, Mr. Yates," Faith said. "I simply want what is rightfully mine according to my father's wishes, a place to live and my fair share of the profits." A harsh laugh escaped Isaac's throat. "Live? Here? Lady, this ain't Boston or wherever you're from. This is working country, brutal country. You wouldn't last a week." Faith's patience, already stretched thin by grief and the long journey, began to fray. "I'm from Philadelphia, Mr. Yates, not that it matters, and I'm tougher than I look. My father always said so." "Your father was a businessman who visited twice in 5 years. He didn't know the first thing about running a ranch." "Perhaps not," Faith conceded, "but he knew about contracts and partnerships, and I intend to honor what he built." She gestured to the driver who was unloading her trunks. "Now, if you'd be so kind as to show me to my accommodations, I'm quite tired from the journey." Isaac stared at her as if she'd sprouted horns. Then he turned to Tom. "Put her in the old foreman's cabin. It's empty since Jenkins left." He fixed Faith with a cold glare. "This ain't over, Miss Fairchild. Not by a long shot. You'll be heading back east before the week is out." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked back toward the corral, leaving Faith standing in the yard, dusty and weary but absolutely determined. The foreman's cabin was little more than a single room with a small lean-to kitchen attached. A narrow bed, a scarred table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a pot-bellied stove were its only furnishings. The air inside was stale and dusty, but at least the roof appeared solid. "Will there be anything else, madam?" Tom asked awkwardly as he set down the last of her trunks. Faith surveyed her new home with a sinking heart but kept her expression neutral. "No, thank you. You've been most helpful, Mr. Cooper, madam. Tom Cooper. I've been with the boss for 6 years now." Faith nodded, noting the loyalty in his voice. "Well, Mr. Cooper, I appreciate your assistance. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." After Tom left, Faith allowed herself a moment of doubt. The cabin was a far cry from her comfortable Philadelphia home, and Isaac Yates was exactly the kind of obstinate, difficult man her father had described. But Samuel Fairchild had also written of the ranch's beauty, its potential, and the extraordinary skill with which Isaac handled horses. Faith moved to the small, grimy window and wiped away enough dust to see outside. In the distance, She could make out Isaac in the corral with the black stallion. Even from here, she could sense the tension between man and beast, a battle of wills with no clear winner. "Well, father," she whispered to the empty room, "you certainly left me with a challenge." That evening, after washing away the worst of the travel dust with water from the pump outside her cabin, Faith changed into a simpler dress and decided to explore the ranch. The main house loomed in the distance, a substantial two-story structure built of hewn logs and stone, but she turned instead toward the stables, drawn by the sound of horses. The stable was immaculate, with neat rows of stalls housing some of the finest horses Faith had ever seen. Growing up in her father's house, she'd learned to ride at an early age and had developed a genuine appreciation for good horseflesh. "You shouldn't be in here." Faith turned to find Isaac watching her from the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "I was admiring your horses," she replied evenly. "They're beautiful animals." "They're valuable animals," Isaac corrected, stepping inside, "and they don't take kindly to strangers." As if to contradict him, a chestnut mare in the nearest stall stretched her neck over the door, nickering softly at Faith. Without thinking, Faith reached out, letting the horse sniff her palm before gently stroking its velvety nose. Isaac's eyebrows rose slightly. "Seems Penny's made up her mind about you. Horses are excellent judges of character," Faith replied with the ghost of a smile. "My father taught me that." At the mention of Samuel, Isaac's expression hardened again. "Look, Miss Fairchild." "Faith," she interrupted. "If we're to be partners, you might as well use my given name." Isaac's jaw tightened. "We ain't partners, not yet, not ever if I have any say in it. I've sent for my lawyer in Denver. He'll straighten this out." Faith nodded, continuing to stroke the mare. "That's fine. My father's lawyer provided me with copies of everything. I'm confident they'll confirm my position." Isaac ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What do you want? Money? Is that it? Because if Samuel was entitled to any profits, I'll pay what's owed, but this ranch is mine." "It's not about money," Faith replied softly. "My father loved this place. In his letters, he described it as a piece of heaven carved out of the wilderness. When he died, I discovered just how much of himself he'd invested here, not just financially, but emotionally. I need to understand why." Isaac studied her for a long moment. In the fading light, with her hair coming loose from its pins and her face softened by the gentle way she handled the horse, she looked less like an adversary and more like a lost soul seeking answers. "Your father visited twice," Isaac finally said. "First time was after the loan partnership, whatever you want to call it. He stayed for 3 days. Second time was 2 years ago. He stayed for a week, followed me around, asked 1,000 questions about horses and ranching." "And what did you tell him?" Isaac shrugged. "The truth. That it's hard, thankless work. That most days you're too tired to think and too sore to care. That sometimes the only thing keeping you going is the knowledge that giving up would be worse." Faith's hand stilled on the mare's nose. "And yet you continue." "It's what I know," Isaac replied simply. "It's what I am." For a brief moment, they stood in almost companionable silence, the tension between them easing slightly. Then Isaac seemed to remember himself. "Supper's at the cookhouse in half an hour. You can join the hands if you want food." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Faith alone with the horses and the growing darkness. The cookhouse was a long, low building with rough-hewn tables and benches where the ranch hands took their meals. When Faith entered, conversation immediately ceased, and a dozen pairs of eyes turned in her direction. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her chin up as she made her way to the serving table where a weathered older man ladled stew from a large pot. "Evening, miss," he said with a nod. "Name's Hank. I do the cooking around here when I ain't tending to the livestock. Hope you don't mind beef stew. It ain't fancy, but it'll keep you standing." "It smells wonderful," Faith assured him, accepting the bowl with a smile. "Thank you, Hank." She turned to face the room, momentarily uncertain where to sit, when Tom Cooper stood and gestured to an empty space on his bench. Faith gratefully took the offered seat. "Don't mind the boys," Tom said quietly. "They ain't used to female company at meals. Most of 'em have forgotten their manners, if they ever had any to begin with." Gradually, conversation resumed, though it was more subdued than before. Faith ate quietly, listening to the ranch hands discuss the day's work, the condition of the range, and speculation about a coming storm. Isaac was nowhere to be seen, and when she asked about his absence, Tom explained that the boss usually took his meals alone in the main house. "Has he always been so?" Faith searched for a diplomatic word, prickly as a cactus. Tom supplied with a grin. "Yes, madam. For as long as I've known him. But there ain't a better horseman alive, and he's fair with his men. Works harder than any of us, too." "And the scar?" Faith asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Tom's smile faded. "That's his story to tell if he ever chooses to. All I know is it happened before he came to Colorado." After supper, Faith helped clear the dishes despite Hank's protests that it wasn't necessary. She was wiping down the tables when she heard a commotion outside. Following the sound, she emerged from the cookhouse to see several ranch hands gathered around the corral where Isaac was attempting to saddle the black stallion from earlier. The horse was having none of it. Each time Isaac approached with the saddle, the stallion reared, eyes rolling wildly, hooves slashing at the air. Isaac's face was set in grim determination, his movements controlled but forceful. "That devil's spawn has thrown him 3 times already," one of the hands remarked to Faith as she joined the watchers. "Boss is determined to break him, but that horse might just be the one to break the boss instead." Faith watched with growing concern as Isaac, moving with a deceptive casualness, approached the stallion again. This time, he managed to get the saddle blanket over the horse's back, but when he tried to follow with the saddle, the stallion exploded into action, bucking and spinning. Isaac dodged the flailing hooves, but his expression had grown darker, more determined. "Why must he break the horse's spirit?" Faith asked, unable to keep the distress from her voice. "Surely there are gentler ways," the hand beside her chuckled. "That's not how it's done out here, madam." "Wild things need to be shown who's master," Faith frowned. "My father had a saying, you can force a horse to bend, but you can't force it to trust." Before the ranch hand could respond, a collective gasp rose from the gathered men. The stallion had reared again, and this time its hoof caught Isaac's shoulder, sending him staggering back against the corral fence. For a moment he seemed stunned, but then he straightened, his face a mask of cold fury. Faith acted without thinking. She slipped through the fence rails and walked steadily toward Isaac, ignoring the shouts of warning from the hands. "Mr. Yates," she said firmly, placing herself between him and the stallion. "You're hurt and you're angry. This isn't the time to continue." Isaac glared at her, one hand clutching his injured shoulder. "Get out of my corral, Miss Fairchild. This is none of your concern. It is if you're about to undo months of work with this horse because you're too stubborn to stop when you should," she replied, keeping her voice calm and even. The stallion, sensing the change in dynamics, had stopped bucking and stood watching them warily, nostrils flared and sides heaving. "You don't know the first thing about breaking horses," Isaac growled. "No," Faith agreed, "but I know something about patience. And right now that horse is scared and confused, and you're in no condition to continue." For several tense seconds they stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Then, surprisingly, it was Isaac who broke eye contact first. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll finish tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Faith noticed blood seeping through his shirt where the stallion's hoof had connected. "You need that shoulder tended to," she said, following him out of the corral. "I've had worse," Isaac replied dismissively, but his face was pale beneath his tan, and his steps weren't as steady as usual. "I'm sure you have," Faith said, matching his stride. "But infection doesn't care about your pride, Mr. Yates. Now, does this ranch have medical supplies, or shall I use what I brought with me?" Isaac stopped and looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. "There's a kit in the main house," he finally said. "Doc Reynolds only comes through once a month unless there's an emergency." The interior of the main house was a surprise. Faith had expected something Spartan and utilitarian, but instead found a well-appointed home with solid furniture, polished floors, and shelves filled with books. The walls were adorned with a few good paintings, and a large stone fireplace dominated the main room. "My mother had ideas about how a proper home should look," Isaac explained gruffly when he saw her surprise. "Sit down. I'll get the medical kit." "I'd prefer to see to that shoulder first," Faith insisted. "Your shirt will need to come off." Isaac gave her a look that might have been amusement on a less stern face. "You going to help me with that too, Miss Fairchild?" Faith felt her cheeks warm but kept her composure. "If necessary, yes. Though I imagine you can manage if you go slowly." To her surprise, Isaac did as she suggested, carefully unbuttoning his shirt and easing it off his injured shoulder with a barely suppressed wince. Faith's breath caught at the sight of his torso, not just from the impressively muscled physique of a man who worked hard every day, but from the network of old scars that crisscrossed his back and chest. "War?" she asked softly as she examined the fresh injury, which was beginning to bruise dramatically but hadn't broken the skin as badly as she'd feared. Isaac nodded once. "Confederate cavalry. Spent 2 years riding with Mosby's Rangers." Faith carefully cleaned the wound, aware of Isaac's tension as she worked. His skin was warm beneath her fingers and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart. "You're not what I expected," Isaac said suddenly. Faith glanced up at him, her hands pausing in their work. "Oh. And what did you expect, Mr. Yates? A spoiled Eastern socialite who'd faint at the sight of blood and run screaming from a spider," he replied bluntly. "Not someone who'd walk into a corral with an unbroken stallion to lecture me on horse handling." Faith resumed cleaning the wound, a small smile playing at her lips. "My father didn't raise a coward, Mr. Yates. He raised a woman who speaks her mind and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty." She began binding his shoulder with clean bandages. "And for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what I expected." "And what's that?" A stubborn, solitary man who'd rather bleed than admit he might be wrong about something or someone. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something indefinable passed between them. Then Isaac looked away. "You still don't belong here," he said, but some of the hostility had gone from his voice. Faith tied off the bandage and stepped back. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But I'm here nonetheless, and I intend to stay until I understand why this place meant so much to my father." She gathered the medical supplies and returned them to their box. "Now you should rest that shoulder. Doctor's orders." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "You're a doctor now." "No," Faith replied, heading for the door. "Just someone with common sense, which seems to be in short supply around here." "Good night, Mr. Yates." As she walked back to her cabin in the gathering darkness, Faith couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of Isaac Yates. Beneath the harsh exterior and uncompromising demeanor was a man who had survived war, built something substantial from nothing, and maintained a beautiful home that spoke of refinement at odds with his rough manner. Perhaps Faith thought as she lit the lamp in her small cabin. There was more to the harsh cowboy than met the eye. And perhaps, given time and patience, she might discover what that was. Dawn broke over Whiskey River Ranch in a spectacular display of pinks and golds that painted the distant mountains and cast long shadows across the valley. Faith, who had slept fitfully in the unfamiliar bed, rose early and stepped outside to witness the transformation. The air was crisp and sweet with the scent of sage and pine, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of peace. That peace was short-lived. As she made her way to the cookhouse for breakfast, she heard raised voices coming from the main corral. Isaac, despite his injury, was back at work with the black stallion, and from the looks of it, neither man nor beast was in a better mood than the day before. Faith paused, watching as Isaac approached the stallion with a rope halter. His movements were hampered by his injured shoulder, making him slower and less fluid than he should have been. The stallion sensed the weakness and skittered away, eyes rolling. "Stubborn fool," Faith muttered, torn between intervention and letting Isaac learn his lesson the hard way. Her decision was made for her when one of the ranch hands, a young man barely out of his teens whom she'd met at supper the previous night, approached her hesitantly. "Miss Fairchild, boss asked for you. Said if you're so full of opinions about horse handling, you might as well make yourself useful." Faith raised her eyebrows in surprise. Did he now? Those exact words? The young man, Billy, she recalled, blushed. "Well, no, madam. His exact words ain't suitable for a lady's ears, but that was the gist of it." Faith suppressed a smile. "Thank you, Billy. I'll go see what Mr. Yates requires." As she approached the corral, Isaac's eyes tracked her, his expression unreadable. He dispensed with his usual coat due to the injury, wearing only a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill. The bandage Faith had applied was visible at his collar. "You sent for me?" Faith asked, coming to stand beside him at the fence. "You said there were gentler ways," Isaac replied without preamble. "Show me." Faith blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon," Isaac gestured to the stallion, which was watching them warily from the far side of the corral. "You implied there was a better way to handle him. I'm giving you the chance to prove it." Faith studied him, trying to determine if this was some kind of test or trap. His face gave nothing away, but there was a challenge in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. "Very well," she said, removing her shawl and draping it over the fence rail. "But I'll need a few things. An apple or carrot if you have any, and time. Lots of time." Isaac nodded to Billy, who hurried off toward the kitchen garden where Hank grew vegetables for the ranch. While they waited, Faith surveyed the corral and the stallion. "What do you know about him?" she asked. "Where did he come from?" "Caught him in the high country last spring," Isaac replied. "He was running with a small band of wild horses, finest specimen I've seen in years." "Does he have a name?" Isaac shrugged his good shoulder. "Been calling him Devil on account of his temperament." Faith frowned. "That's hardly going to encourage good behavior. Names have power, Mr. Yates. They shape our expectations." Before Isaac could respond, Billy returned with several carrots freshly pulled from the garden. Faith took them with a word of thanks, then surprised both men by sitting down on a nearby stump, making no move to enter the corral. "What are you waiting for?" Isaac asked after a minute of silence. "I'm letting him get used to me," Faith explained, keeping her voice low and calm. "Horses are prey animals, Mr. Yates. They're naturally cautious of predators, which is how they see us. The first step isn't to assert dominance, it's to prove we're not a threat." For nearly an hour, Faith simply sat, occasionally speaking in soft tones to the stallion, who gradually moved closer out of curiosity. The ranch hands, intrigued by the unusual approach, gathered to watch. Even Isaac, though clearly skeptical, remained silent. His arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the fence. Finally, when the stallion had moved to within about 10 feet of where she sat, Faith slowly stood and approached the corral fence. "Now I'll go in," she said to Isaac. "But slowly and without any expectations. This will take days, not hours." "Days?" Isaac echoed incredulously. "I don't have days to waste on one horse." "Is it wasted time if the result is a mount who trusts you rather than fears you, who works with you rather than against you?" Faith countered. "My father always said a horse broken by fear is never truly reliable. One day, that fear will resurface, usually at the worst possible moment." Isaac's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the corral. Faith did so carefully, moving in a wide arc to avoid approaching the stallion directly. She kept her body language open and relaxed, her movements deliberate but unhurried. For the next 2 hours, Faith worked with the stallion, never forcing anything, simply allowing him to become accustomed to her presence. She spoke to him continuously in a soft, soothing voice, occasionally offering a piece of carrot from her outstretched palm. By mid-morning, she had managed to touch his neck briefly before he skittered away. "You're going to need a better name than Devil," she murmured to the horse as he cautiously approached her again. "Something that honors your spirit without condemning it." She studied his glossy black coat and the proud arch of his neck. Midnight, perhaps, or Shadow. The horse's ears flicked forward at the second name. Shadow it is, then. From his position by the fence, Isaac watched with growing interest. The woman's methods were unlike anything he'd seen before. Gentler, yes, but also more attuned to the horse's natural instincts. She moved with a patience that seemed infinite, never showing frustration even when the stallion retreated from her touch. Most surprising was how she spoke to the animal, not as a dumb beast to be conquered, but as an intelligent being deserving of respect. It reminded Isaac, uncomfortably, of how his mother had spoken to him as a child before the war, before everything changed. When Faith finally exited the corral, her face was flushed with the morning sun, and her hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her shoulders. Despite the dust on her dress and the sweat on her brow, there was something undeniably beautiful about her in that moment, a vitality that Isaac found himself responding to despite his best efforts. "That's it?" he asked as she retrieved her shawl from the fence rail. 2 hours and all you managed was to touch him once, Faith smiled, unperturbed by his skepticism. "Rome wasn't built in a day, Mr. Yates, neither is trust. But yes, for today that's enough. Tomorrow we'll build on it. And how long before he can be ridden?" "That depends on him, not me," Faith replied. "But if you're asking for my estimate, I'd say 2 weeks before he'll accept a saddle without fear, and another week before he's ready for a rider." Isaac's expression darkened. 3 weeks? I've never spent more than 3 days breaking a horse. "And how many of those horses truly trusted you when you were done?" Faith asked quietly. "How many came to you willingly, eager for your company rather than fearful of your consequences?" The question struck Isaac like a physical blow. It was true that most of the horses he'd broken over the years responded to his commands out of fear rather than affection. They were serviceable mounts, but few showed any particular bond with him. "This isn't some fancy riding academy," he said defensively. "This is working country. I need horses that do what they're told when they're told to do it." "And you'll have that," Faith assured him, "but you'll have more. You'll have a partner instead of a servant." She looked back at Shadow, who was watching them from the center of the corral. "He's special, that one. Worth the extra time." Isaac couldn't argue with that assessment. The stallion's conformation was exceptional, his bloodline clearly superior to the average Mustang. If he could be properly trained, he'd be worth a small fortune as a breeding stallion. Fine, he finally conceded. We'll try it your way for a week, but if there's no significant progress by then, we go back to my methods. Faith nodded, recognizing the compromise for what it was. Agreed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've missed breakfast and could use some coffee. As she walked away, Isaac found himself watching her with a mixture of irritation and something dangerously close to admiration. Samuel Fairchild's daughter was proving to be as stubborn as her father had been, but with a quiet determination that was strangely compelling. "You might be in trouble there, boss," Tom remarked, coming to stand beside him. Isaac tore his gaze away from Faith's retreating figure. "What are you talking about?" Tom nodded toward the corral where Shadow was now calmly grazing. "That lady just got further with that horse in 2 hours than you did in 2 days, and she did it without raising a sweat or her voice. It's a novelty to the horse, that's all," Isaac dismissed. "He's never seen a woman before." "Maybe," Tom conceded. "Or maybe she knows something about wild things that you don't." Isaac shot his foreman a warning look, but Tom just grinned and walked away, leaving Isaac to ponder the implications of Faith Fairchild's gentle approach not just to horses, but perhaps to other wild, untamed things as well. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Faith would spend several hours each morning working with Shadow, gradually earning the stallion's trust. Isaac, despite his initial skepticism, found himself watching these sessions with growing interest, noting how the horse responded to Faith's patience and consistency. By the 5th day, Shadow was allowing Faith to touch him freely, even lowering his proud head to nibble carrots from her hand. On the 6th day, she was able to slip a halter over his head without any resistance, a milestone that drew appreciative murmurs from the ranch hands who had taken to watching the daily sessions. "He's accepting the halter because he associates it with you," Isaac observed as Faith led Shadow around the corral on a lead rope. "What happens when someone else tries to handle him?" Faith glanced over at him with a smile. "Why don't you find out?" She held out the lead rope. "Slowly, though. Let him see you clearly and come to you, not the other way around." Isaac hesitated, then stepped into the corral, moving with a deliberate calm that was at odds with his usual forceful approach. Shadow's ears flicked forward, his dark eyes assessing the newcomer warily. "Talk to him," Faith suggested softly. "Let him hear your voice without anger or frustration." Isaac felt foolish, but he cleared his throat and began to speak in low, measured tones. "Hey there, boy. Fine-looking animal, aren't you? Born to run, I'd wager. Born to be free." To his surprise, Shadow's initial wariness seemed to fade. The stallion didn't approach, but neither did he retreat when Isaac slowly moved closer, still talking in that same calm voice. When Isaac finally reached them, Faith quietly transferred the lead rope to his hand. "Now you're in charge," she said. "But remember, it's not about controlling him. It's about communicating with him." Isaac nodded, strangely affected by the trust in both pairs of eyes watching him, one equine, one human. He gently tugged the lead rope, and Shadow followed willingly, circling the corral beside him. "Well, I'll be damned," Isaac murmured. Faith smiled. "He's accepting you because he's learning that humans can be trusted, that we're not all pain and dominance." Isaac glanced at her, something shifting in his perception of this Eastern woman who had disrupted his life so thoroughly. "Where did you learn this approach? I doubt they teach horse whispering in Philadelphia finishing schools." Faith laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to lighten the very air around them. "No, they certainly don't. My mother died when I was young and my father raised me alone. He was often too busy with his business affairs to supervise me properly. So I spent a lot of time at my uncle's farm outside the city. He raised horses, not wild ones like these, but fine carriage horses and riding stock. He was the one who taught me that patience accomplishes more with horses than force ever could. Your uncle sounds like a wise man. He was, Faith agreed, a shadow crossing her face. He died in '73, influenza. Isaac nodded, understanding the grief that still lingered in her voice. Death was a constant companion on the frontier, taking young and old alike without warning or mercy. "And your father," he asked, "was his passing sudden?" Faith stroked Shadow's neck as she replied, "Not entirely. He had heart troubles for several years. The doctors advised him to retire to rest, but he couldn't stop working. Said he'd rather die with his boots on than waste away in an invalid's chair." She smiled sadly. "He almost got his wish. He collapsed at his desk reviewing some contracts. Lived for 3 more days but never regained consciousness." Isaac continued walking Shadow in a gentle circle, giving Faith a moment to compose herself. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than usual. "Samuel was a good man, fair in his dealings. I didn't always appreciate his interference or his endless questions, but he never tried to tell me how to run the ranch." He paused. "Unlike some people." Faith caught the teasing note in his voice and responded with a raised eyebrow. "I'm not telling you how to run your ranch, Mr. Yates. Merely suggesting improvements to your horse-breaking methods." "Is that what you call it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like a city woman thinking she knows better than a man who's been working horses his whole life." "Perhaps," Faith conceded, "or perhaps it's simply someone offering a fresh perspective." She took the lead rope back from him and began guiding Shadow toward the corral gate. Sometimes an outsider can see things that those too close to the situation miss. Isaac watched as she removed the halter and released Shadow back into the larger pasture where he could graze freely. "And what else do your fresh eyes see about Whiskey River that needs improving, Miss Fairchild?" Faith turned to face him, shielding her eyes from the midday sun. "I've noticed your fences need mending on the North Range. Your hay storage is insufficient for a hard winter. The bunkhouse roof leaks when it rains, according to Billy. And you work yourself and your men too hard without taking time to appreciate what you've built here." Isaac stared at her, caught between annoyance and reluctant admiration for her observational skills. "Anything else?" he asked dryly. "Yes," Faith replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "You're lonely, Mr. Yates. This beautiful house you've built sits mostly empty. You take your meals alone when you could be building camaraderie with your men, and you keep everyone at arm's length, as if you're afraid of what might happen if you let someone get close." The directness of her assessment left Isaac momentarily speechless. No one had spoken to him so candidly in years, perhaps ever. Most people were too intimidated by his reputation or his demeanor to challenge him. "You don't know the first thing about me," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I know what I see," Faith replied simply. "And what I see is a man who's built walls around himself that are higher and stronger than any fence on this property." She handed him the halter and lead rope. "But walls can be dismantled, Mr. Yates, one stone at a time." With that, she walked away, leaving Isaac standing in the corral with equipment in his hands and thoughts he wasn't ready to examine churning in his mind. That evening, to the surprise of everyone at Whiskey River, Isaac appeared at the cookhouse for supper. The conversation among the hands stuttered to a halt as he entered, but he ignored their shocked expressions and took a seat at the end of a table, nodding for Hank to serve him like everyone else. Faith, who was already seated with Tom and Billy, watched with barely concealed amusement as the ranch hands gradually resumed their conversations. though with frequent nervous glances at their boss. Isaac ate methodically, occasionally responding to a direct question but otherwise keeping to himself. When the meal was finished, and the men began drifting out to enjoy a pipe or game of cards before turning in, Isaac approached Faith's table. "Miss Fairchild," he said formally, "I wondered if you might join me for coffee on the porch of the main house. There are some ranch matters I'd like to discuss." Faith noted the speculative glances from Tom and Billy, but kept her expression neutral. "Of course, Mr. Yates, I'd be delighted." The night was clear and cool, the sky a vast canopy of stars unobscured by city lights or pollution. Faith sat in a sturdy rocking chair on the main house porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands against the evening chill. Beside her, Isaac occupied a similar chair, his long legs stretched out before him, his face in profile as he gazed out at the darkened ranch. "You were right about the fences," he said abruptly. "I've been meaning to send a crew to repair the North Range section, but we've been short-handed since 2 of my men left to try their luck in the gold fields." Faith sipped her coffee, surprised by the admission. "It's not criticism, Mr. Yates, merely observation." "Isaac," he said after a brief hesitation, "if I'm to call you Faith, then you should use my given name as well." Faith smiled into her cup. "Very well, Isaac, thank you for the coffee. It's much better than what Hank serves in the cookhouse." "Don't tell him that. He's sensitive about his coffee." Isaac's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "This is my mother's blend. She always insisted on grinding the beans fresh. She sounds like a woman of discerning taste." Isaac nodded, his expression growing distant. "She was too refined for the life my father chose for us. They homesteaded in Kansas after moving from Virginia. Hard country, harder living. It broke her in the end." Faith heard the pain beneath the matter-of-fact tone and understood instinctively that this was not a story Isaac shared often or perhaps ever. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Isaac shrugged, taking a long drink of his coffee before continuing. "She died when I was 16. Father followed 2 years later. Liver gave out from too much whiskey. I joined the Confederate Army the next day. Seemed as good a direction as any at the time. And after the war, drifted west. Worked as a hand on ranches in Texas, then New Mexico Territory. Learned everything I could about horses and cattle, saved every penny." He gestured to the land spread out before them. "Bought the first 100 acres of this place in '68, built it up piece by piece." "It's impressive," Faith said sincerely, "what you've accomplished here. My father often spoke of your determination and vision." Isaac turned to look at her directly, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the lantern hanging beside the door. "Why did you really come here, Faith? You could have sent lawyers to assert your claim. You didn't need to make the journey yourself." Faith set her coffee cup aside, considering her answer carefully. "After my father died, I discovered how little I knew him. He was always working, always focused on the next business deal. I knew he was proud of me in his way, but there was a distance between us that I never managed to bridge." She looked out at the star-filled sky. "In his papers, I found his correspondence about this place, letters to you, to his lawyer, journal entries about his visits. He wrote about Whiskey River with a passion I'd never seen him express for anything in Philadelphia. And you thought coming here would help you understand why," Isaac finished for her. Faith nodded. "Yes, and perhaps help me understand him a little better in the process." She turned back to him. "I didn't expect to stay initially. I thought I would see the ranch, settle the legal matters, and return east. But being here, experiencing what he experienced." She gestured to the vista before them. "There's something special about this land, something that gets under your skin." "It does at that," Isaac agreed softly. "Though it can be as harsh as it is beautiful. You haven't seen it in winter when the snow piles higher than a man's head and the wind cuts like a knife. Or in drought, when the streams dry up and the grass withers to dust. Is that your way of suggesting I should return to Philadelphia before the seasons change? Faith asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Isaac studied her for a long moment. No, he finally said. It's my way of saying that loving this land means accepting all of it, the beauty and the brutality. It's not a place for the faint of heart. I'm beginning to understand that, Faith replied. The same could be said of its people, I think. The implication hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly. Instead, they sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them, and the distant howl of coyotes echoed across the valley. When Faith finally rose to return to her cabin, Isaac walked beside her, a lantern in his hand to light their way. The gesture was unexpectedly courteous from a man who had initially been so hostile to her presence. At her door, Faith turned to thank him for the coffee and conversation. In the soft glow of the lantern, Isaac's features seemed less severe, the hard lines of his face softened by shadow and perhaps something else, something that made Faith's heart beat a little faster. "Good night, Isaac," she said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Good night, Faith," he replied, his voice lower than usual. For a moment it seemed he might say more, but then he nodded once and stepped back. "Dawn comes early. You should rest." As he walked away, Faith watched him, a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. The harsh cowboy was revealing layers she hadn't expected: depth, thoughtfulness, even vulnerability beneath the rough exterior. And despite her best efforts to maintain a businesslike perspective on their relationship, she found herself increasingly drawn to the enigma that was Isaac Yates. "Be careful," she whispered to herself as she entered her cabin. "This isn't why you came here." But as she prepared for bed, Faith couldn't help but wonder if perhaps it was exactly why she had been drawn to Whiskey River, not just to understand her father's connection to this wild place, but to forge unexpected connections of her own. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with dark clouds building on the western horizon. Isaac, who could read the Colorado sky like others read books, ordered the hands to secure anything that might blow away and to move the most vulnerable livestock to more sheltered pastures. "Storm's coming," he told Faith when she arrived at the corral for her daily session with Shadow. "Big one by the look of it. We might want to postpone today's training." Faith glanced at the darkening sky. "How long do we have?" "Few hours, maybe less. Mountain storms can move fast." Faith nodded decisively. "Then we have time for a short session. I'd like to try something new today if you're willing to participate." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to start accustoming Shadow to a saddle blanket." "Nothing more than that today, just letting him feel it on his back without associating it with restraint or pain." She looked up at Isaac. "But I think it would be more effective if you're the one to do it." "Me? Why?" "Because eventually you'll be the one riding him," Faith explained. "And because he needs to trust you as much as he trusts me." Isaac considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. What do I need to do?" Faith smiled, pleased by his willingness to follow her lead. "Just what we've been doing: slow, gentle movements, lots of reassurance. I'll be right beside you." They entered the corral together, Faith first with a halter and lead rope, Isaac following with a simple saddle blanket folded over his arm. Shadow approached Faith readily now, even lowering his head to make it easier for her to slip on the halter. "Good boy," she murmured, stroking his neck. "Such a good, brave boy." Isaac watched the interaction with newfound appreciation. The transformation in the stallion was remarkable: from wild, terrified creature to an animal that clearly trusted Faith implicitly. Even more surprising was the transformation in himself over the past week. He'd gone from dismissing Faith's methods to grudgingly accepting their efficacy, and now to actively participating in them. "Ready?" Faith asked, bringing Shadow to stand beside Isaac. Isaac nodded, holding out his hand for the stallion to sniff. Shadow did so cautiously, but without the fear he'd shown initially. Isaac began speaking to him in the same low, steady tone Faith had encouraged, telling the horse about the ranch, the mountains, the coming storm, nonsense really, but the words weren't important. It was the tone that mattered, the establishment of connection. Gradually, Isaac brought the folded blanket into Shadow's line of sight, allowing the horse to inspect it, to sniff it and determine it wasn't a threat. Faith stood on Shadow's other side, one hand on his neck, a steady, calming presence. "Now, very slowly, lift it toward his back," she instructed. "If he startles, stop and wait for him to calm again." Isaac followed her directions, moving with a patience he'd rarely exercised in his life. Shadow tensed when the blanket first touched his back but didn't bolt. Instead, he turned his head to look at Faith as if seeking reassurance. "That's it," she encouraged them both. "Nice and easy." With infinite care, Isaac spread the blanket across Shadow's back. The stallion shifted his weight nervously but remained in place, accepting the unfamiliar sensation. "Well done," Faith whispered, her face alight with pleasure. "Both of you." Isaac felt an unexpected surge of pride not just in the horse's progress, but in his own ability to adapt, to learn a new approach after years of doing things his way. The realization was both humbling and strangely liberating. They continued working with Shadow for another half-hour, allowing him to grow accustomed to the blanket, removing it and replacing it several times until he accepted the process without anxiety. By the end of the session, Isaac's shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool air, and his respect for Faith's methods had grown immeasurably. "I think that's enough for today," Faith said as a distant rumble of thunder reached them. "He's done wonderfully." Isaac nodded, helping her remove the blanket and halter. As they released Shadow back into the pasture, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering on the dust of the corral. "We should get inside," Isaac said, glancing at the rapidly darkening sky. "Looks like the storm is moving faster than I thought." They barely made it to the main house before the heavens opened. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the roof and turning the yard into a sea of mud. Faith stood on the covered porch, watching in awe as lightning forked across the sky and thunder crashed overhead. "It's magnificent," she breathed, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the damp chill. "And dangerous," Isaac replied, coming to stand beside her. "That lightning could easily start a fire if it hits in the wrong place." He studied the storm with a practiced eye. "We're in for a long one, I think. You might as well come inside and get dry." Faith hesitated only briefly before following him into the house. The main room was as she remembered it, tastefully furnished with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Isaac immediately set about building a fire, arranging kindling and logs with practiced efficiency. "There are some of my mother's old clothes in the chest upstairs," he said as he worked. "They might be a bit large for you, but they'd be better than staying in those wet things. Second door on the right." Faith thanked him and made her way up the wooden staircase to the second floor. The room he directed her to was clearly a woman's bedroom, preserved almost as a shrine. A fine cherry-wood dresser held silver-backed brushes and combs, and a vase of dried wildflowers sat on the nightstand beside a well-worn Bible. The chest at the foot of the bed contained several dresses of a style popular before the war. Faith selected the simplest, a blue calico day dress that, as Isaac had warned, was several inches too long for her. Still, once she'd changed out of her damp clothing and pinned up the hem as best she could, it was comfortable enough. When she returned downstairs, she found Isaac had removed his wet coat and boots and was stoking the now blazing fire. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered in his eyes at the sight of her in his mother's dress. "It suits you," he said simply, turning back to the fire. Faith moved to warm herself by the flames. "Thank you for lending it to me. I hope you don't mind." "She would have liked you, I think," Isaac replied after a pause. "My mother. She valued education and refinement, but she also had a practical streak. She learned to make do with what was available and to find beauty, even in difficult circumstances." He gestured to the painting hanging above the fireplace, a small but exquisite landscape of mountains, similar to those surrounding the ranch. "She painted that our first spring here. Said she wanted to capture the moment when the world turns green again after the long white winter." Faith studied the painting with new appreciation. "She was talented." "She was," Isaac agreed. "She taught school back in Virginia before she married my father. Always said she'd go back to it someday, but—" He trailed off, his expression distant. "Life doesn't always allow us to follow the paths we imagine for ourselves," Faith said softly. Isaac looked at her sharply. "Is that why you never married? Life taking you down an unexpected path?" Faith was surprised by the personal question from a man who had been so reserved until now. "Partly," she admitted. "I had opportunities, but none that seemed right. My father's business required much of his attention, and after my mother died, much of the social responsibility fell to me. Hosting dinners, attending functions, maintaining the connections that helped his enterprise thrive." She smiled faintly. "And I suppose I'm a bit particular. I always believed marriage should be a partnership of equals, minds and hearts aligned in purpose." "An uncommon view," Isaac observed. "Perhaps, but I've seen too many marriages of convenience turn bitter over time. My father and mother loved each other deeply. Their letters to each other during their courtship were beautiful, full of shared dreams and genuine affection. After she died, he never remarried, never even looked at another woman as far as I know." Faith gazed into the fire. "I think he measured all other relationships against what they had and found them wanting." Isaac was silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain the only sounds in the room. "I was engaged once," he finally said, the words emerging slowly as if they were being pulled from deep within him. "Before the war. Her name was Rebecca. Daughter of a neighboring farmer in Kansas." Faith kept her eyes on the fire, instinctively understanding that looking at him might make it harder for him to continue. "When I returned from the war, she was married to someone else. Said she couldn't wait forever, not knowing if I was dead or alive." His voice held no bitterness, only a resigned acceptance. "She was right to move on. I wasn't the same man who left. War changes you in ways you can't explain to those who haven't seen it." "Is that how you got the scar?" Faith asked gently. Isaac's hand went unconsciously to his face, tracing the line from temple to jaw. "Saber cut at Yellow Tavern, May of '64. We lost General Stewart in that battle. After that, the heart went out of the cavalry." Faith finally turned to look at him, seeing not just the physical scar but the deeper wounds that war and loss had left on his soul. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Isaac shrugged. "It was a lifetime ago. Another man's life sometimes feels like—" He stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses. Storm like this can spook them." "I'll come with you," Faith said, rising as well. "I'm concerned about Shadow." Isaac looked as if he might object, but then nodded. "Take my spare oilskin coat from the hook by the door, and stay close. Visibility's poor in this rain." They ventured out into the storm, huddled beneath oilskin coats as they made their way to the stables. The rain had turned the yard to mud that sucked at their boots with each step, and the wind drove the water into their faces despite their protective gear. The stables were dim but dry, the familiar scents of hay and horses a comfort after the chaos outside. Most of the animals were calm enough, though a few shuffled nervously at the crash of thunder. Isaac moved efficiently down the row, checking each stall, speaking quietly to the more agitated horses. Faith made her way to the stall where Shadow had been moved for the storm's duration. The stallion was clearly unsettled, pacing the confined space, his dark eyes rolling with each thunderclap. "It's all right," she soothed, approaching the stall door. "Just noise, nothing to fear." Shadow recognized her voice and came to the door, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Faith reached through the bars to stroke his nose, continuing to speak in calm, reassuring tones. "You're good with him," Isaac said, coming to stand beside her. "He trusts you completely." "Trust can be earned with time and consistency," Faith replied, glancing up at him, "even from the wildest spirit." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of parallel meaning beneath her words. For a heartbeat, the storm outside and the horses around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a moment of perfect understanding. Then a particularly violent crash of thunder broke the spell. Shadow reared back in his stall, whinnying in fear, and the other horses responded with their own nervous movements. "We should stay until they settle," Isaac said, moving to check on the other animals again. Faith nodded, returning her attention to Shadow. "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured, as much to herself as to the horse. They remained in the stable for over an hour, until the worst of the storm had passed and the horses had calmed. By the time they returned to the main house, both were soaked despite the oilskins, and the gray afternoon light was fading toward evening. "You should stay here tonight," Isaac said as they hung their dripping coats by the door. "The path to your cabin will be washed out and it's getting dark." Faith knew he was right. Returning to her small cabin in these conditions would be foolhardy at best. Still, the prospect of spending the night under the same roof as Isaac Yates made her unreasonably nervous. "I wouldn't want to impose," she began. "It's not an imposition," Isaac cut her off. "It's common sense. You can take my mother's room. I'll sleep down here by the fire." His tone brooked no argument, and Faith found herself too tired and cold to protest further. "Thank you," she said simply. "That's very kind." Isaac looked almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's nothing. I'll see if Hank can send over some supper for us once the rain lets up a bit." But the rain continued unabated, and eventually Isaac set about preparing a simple meal from the supplies in his own kitchen: beans, bacon, and biscuits left over from breakfast. They ate at the large oak table in the kitchen, the domesticity of the scene at odds with their usual interactions. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Isaac said as they finished their meal. "What was your life like there?" Faith described her childhood home, the cultural life of the city, her education at a prestigious women's seminary. She spoke of her father's business ventures, the social obligations that had filled her calendar, the books and music that had been her true passions. "It sounds—" Isaac searched for the right word. "Confined." Faith looked surprised. "I never thought of it that way, but perhaps you're right. There were expectations, conventions that governed every aspect of life, especially for women." She smiled ruefully. "Here, at least, I can speak my mind without worrying about violating some obscure social rule." "You'd have spoken your mind anyway," Isaac observed with unexpected insight. "You're not one to be silenced by convention." Faith laughed. "No, I suppose not. My father always said I was too outspoken for my own good. It's why I never quite fit in with Philadelphia society." She studied Isaac across the table. What about you? Do you ever miss the East, the amenities of civilization? Isaac considered the question. Sometimes. Books are hard to come by out here. Good music even harder, but the trade-off is worth it. He gestured toward the window where rain still streamed down the glass. Out here, a man can breathe, can be judged by what he builds with his own hands, not by his name or his family connections. Or the side he fought for in the war, Faith added quietly. Isaac's eyes met hers, acknowledging the insight. Yes, that too. He stood, gathering their empty plates, though not everyone is as willing to look past that particular history. The war is over, Isaac, Faith said gently. Has been for 11 years. Tell that to the widows, the men missing limbs, the families who lost sons and fathers and brothers. He shook his head. Some wounds don't heal just because politicians sign papers declaring peace. Faith didn't argue. She had seen enough in her work with veterans' aid societies in Philadelphia to know he was right. Instead, she helped him clear the table and wash the dishes, working together in companionable silence broken only by the continuing patter of rain on the roof. Later, as they sat before the fire with cups of coffee, the conversation turned to the ranch and its operations. Isaac, warming to the subject, explained his breeding program, his plans for expanding the horse training side of the business, and the challenges of managing such a large operation with limited manpower. Have you considered hiring more hands? Faith asked. Or perhaps bringing in a partner with additional capital? Isaac's expression closed slightly. I prefer to keep things manageable. More men means more potential for conflict, more personalities to balance. As for partners, he gave her a pointed look. I've never been good at sharing authority. So I've noticed, Faith replied dryly, though you seem to be adapting to our current arrangement well enough. Our arrangement is temporary, Isaac reminded her, though without the hostility that would have colored such a statement a week ago. Once your legal claim is settled one way or another, you'll go back to Philadelphia. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than either wanted to acknowledge. Faith stared into her coffee, suddenly unsure of what she truly wanted. A week ago, she would have agreed without hesitation that her future lay in Philadelphia. Now, perhaps, she said finally, though I'm finding there's much to appreciate about Colorado. Isaac's gaze lingered on her face, illuminated by the firelight. It grows on you, he admitted softly. Given time. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of them, but neither was ready to address it directly. Instead, they lapsed into silence, listening to the rain and the crackling fire, each lost in thoughts of what might be possible if circumstances were different, if past obligations and uncertain futures didn't stand in the way of the connection that was undeniably forming between them. When Faith finally rose to retire to the upstairs bedroom, she found herself strangely reluctant to end the evening. At the foot of the stairs, she turned back to Isaac, who had risen to see her off. Thank you, she said, for your hospitality and for, she hesitated, for sharing parts of yourself tonight. I know it doesn't come easily to you. Isaac inclined his head slightly, his expression softened by the dim light. Good night, Faith. Sleep well. As she climbed the stairs, Faith felt the weight of his gaze following her, and with it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire she was leaving behind. The storm continued through the night and into the following day, turning streams into torrents and low-lying areas of the ranch into shallow lakes. Faith remained at the main house, as returning to her cabin was impossible until the waters receded. She occupied herself by helping Isaac with indoor tasks, mending tack, taking inventory of supplies, and discussing ranch operations. By the evening of the second day, the rain had finally stopped, though the damage it had wrought was evident everywhere they looked. Fields were flooded, fences washed away in places, and one of the smaller outbuildings had lost half its roof to the wind. "It could have been worse," Isaac remarked as they surveyed the scene from the porch. "No stock lost that we can tell, and the main structures are intact." "Will it take long to repair everything?" Faith asked, pulling her shawl closer against the damp chill that lingered in the air. "A week, maybe 2, depending on how quickly things dry out." Isaac sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's always something on a ranch." "Nature's way of keeping us humble, I suppose." Faith smiled at that. "A perpetual lesson in humility. Perhaps that's why ranchers are such philosophical people." Isaac glanced at her, surprised by the observation. "Some might be. Most I know are too busy surviving to ponder life's deeper meanings." "And yet here you are, building something lasting in a place that constantly reminds you of your mortality and insignificance." Faith gestured to the vast landscape stretching beyond the ranch buildings. "There's philosophy in that choice, whether you recognize it or not." Isaac considered her words, struck once again by the unexpected depths of Samuel Fairchild's daughter. "You have an unusual way of seeing things, Faith. Your father was the same way, always looking beyond the obvious, finding meaning in places others might miss." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" Faith asked, her eyes twinkling. "Both, perhaps," Isaac admitted with a hint of a smile. "It makes for interesting conversation, but can be damned inconvenient when I'm trying to maintain my certainty about things." Faith laughed, the sound bright against the somber backdrop of the storm's aftermath. "Heaven forbid anyone should challenge the great Isaac Yates's certainty." "Exactly," Isaac agreed, his smile widening into something genuine and unguarded. "It's a trial having you here." "I imagine it is," Faith replied, matching his lighter tone, "particularly since I'm right so often." Isaac's laugh surprised them both, a deep, rich sound that seemed to transform his entire being. In that moment, with his eyes crinkled at the corners and years of hardness temporarily set aside, Faith caught a glimpse of the man he might have been without war and loss to shape him. The realization sent a flutter of something dangerously close to longing through her heart. This was not part of her plan, developing feelings for the stubborn, complicated man who still technically opposed her claim to part of his ranch. And yet, the more time she spent with Isaac Yates, the more difficult it became to imagine returning to Philadelphia and never seeing him again. "The path to your cabin should be passable by tomorrow," Isaac said, his expression growing serious again. "Though it might be muddy going for a while." Faith nodded, trying not to examine too closely why the prospect of returning to her own space suddenly seemed less appealing than it should. "Yes, I'm sure it will be fine. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It wasn't an imposition," Isaac said quietly. Then, seeming to catch himself, he added in a more businesslike tone, "We should check on Shadow tomorrow, see how he weathered the storm." "Of course," Faith agreed, grateful for the change of subject. "First thing in the morning." But morning brought unexpected complications. One of the hands rode in from the far pasture with news that a section of creek had overflowed its banks, stranding a group of yearling horses on what had essentially become an island in the midst of rushing water. "They're safe for now," the rider reported to Isaac, "but the water's still rising and they're getting spooked. Might try to swim for it if they panic." Isaac immediately organized a rescue party. "Tom, Billy, get ropes and extra hands. We'll need to create a safe crossing point and guide them back one at a time." Faith, who had been present when the news arrived, stepped forward. "I'd like to help," she said firmly. Isaac's first instinct was to refuse. This was dangerous work. No place for a woman from the East, but one look at her determined expression told him that argument would be futile. And truthfully, they needed every capable pair of hands. "Can you ride well enough to handle rough terrain?" he asked instead. Faith nodded. "I can ride anything you can saddle for me." 20 minutes later, Faith found herself on horseback, riding alongside Isaac and 4 of his men toward the flooded section of creek. She was dressed in her own clothes again, though they were still somewhat damp, with a borrowed oilskin coat over top, and her hair secured tightly beneath a hat to keep it from the mud and branches. The scene that greeted them was worrying. What had normally been a narrow creek about 10 feet across had swollen to nearly 50 feet of churning, debris-filled water. In the middle, a slight rise of land stood like an island, upon which 7 yearling horses huddled nervously, the water encroaching on their diminishing safe ground. "We need to create a guide rope across," Isaac explained to the group. "Tom and I will take the first crossing. The rest of you space yourselves along the banks to catch any horse that gets swept downstream." Faith positioned herself as directed, watching anxiously as Isaac urged his mount into the rushing water. The big bay he rode was steady and strong, but even so, the animal struggled against the current. Tom followed close behind, a coil of heavy rope secured to his saddle horn. It was tense work. Once across, Isaac and Tom established a guide rope attached to trees on both sides of the flood. Then, one by one, they began bringing the yearlings across, sometimes having to enter the water again to calm a particularly frightened animal before leading it to safety. Faith's heart was in her throat each time Isaac disappeared into the churning water, but she maintained her position, ready to assist if any of the horses came her way. By midday, they had rescued 5 of the 7 yearlings. The remaining 2 were the most nervous of the group, shying away each time the men approached. "We're losing daylight," Isaac called across to Faith and the others. "And they're getting more agitated. I'm going to try something different." Before anyone could question his plan, Isaac had dismounted on the island and was approaching the 2 yearlings on foot, speaking to them in the same calm, steady voice Faith had heard him use with Shadow. Incredibly, the first yearling, a dappled gray, allowed Isaac to slip a makeshift halter over its head. Leading it carefully to the water's edge, Isaac used the guide rope to help the young horse navigate the crossing. When it was safely delivered to Billy on the near bank, Isaac returned for the last animal, a skittish chestnut that continued to evade his attempts to capture it. Faith, watching Isaac's growing frustration and the rapidly deteriorating conditions, made a decision. Dismounting, she handed her reins to the nearest ranch hand and began to wade into the water, clinging to the guide rope. "Faith," Isaac shouted when he spotted her. "What the hell are you doing?" "That yearling knows me," Faith called back, continuing her careful progress. "I worked with it last week while you were mending fences." It was true she'd spent time with many of the ranch's horses during her stay, including this particular chestnut yearling that had caught her eye with its intelligent gaze and cautious nature. Isaac looked ready to argue, but seemed to recognize the logic in her statement. He waited as Faith made her way across, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration for her determination. When Faith reached the island, she was soaked to the waist and breathing hard from the exertion of fighting the current. The chestnut yearling watched her warily from the highest point of ground, which was shrinking by the minute as the water continued to rise. "Easy approach," Isaac murmured beside her. "It's terrified." Faith nodded, taking a moment to catch her breath before slowly moving toward the yearling, speaking in the same soothing tones she used with Shadow. "Remember me, beautiful one. We're friends, you and I. I brought you apples last week, remember?" Incredibly, the yearling's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. It took a hesitant step toward her, then another. "That's it," Faith encouraged. "Good boy, such a brave, good boy." When she was finally able to touch the yearling's neck, Faith felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She slipped a lead rope around the young horse's neck and turned to Isaac with a triumphant smile. "Let's go home," she said simply. The crossing back was harrowing. The water had risen further and the current was stronger. Faith led the yearling while Isaac stayed close beside her, one hand on the guide rope, the other ready to grab her if she slipped. Halfway across, disaster struck. A large branch, carried by the current, slammed into the guide rope, causing it to sag dangerously. Faith lost her footing and went under, pulled by the current and the panicking yearling. For a terrifying moment, she was completely submerged, disoriented by the rushing water and the tugging of the lead rope still clutched in her hand. Then strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her up and against a solid chest. "I've got you," Isaac's voice was in her ear as her head broke the surface. "Let go of the rope. Tom has the yearling." Faith couldn't speak, could barely breathe, but she managed to release the lead rope. Isaac's arm tightened around her as he used his free hand to grasp the guide rope, slowly working them toward the bank where the others waited anxiously. When they finally reached solid ground, Isaac lifted Faith bodily from the water and carried her to where the horses were tethered, ignoring her weak protests that she could walk. He set her down carefully against a fallen log, his hands lingering on her shoulders as he crouched before her, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her heart race despite her exhaustion. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with worry. Faith shook her head, still struggling to catch her breath. "Just startled and cold." Isaac immediately shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her, his movements gentle despite the tension evident in every line of his body. "That was reckless," he said, but there was no anger in his tone, only concern and perhaps something deeper. "The yearling," Faith managed, suddenly remembering the animal. "Safe," Isaac assured her. "Thanks to you." His hand came up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, the touch lingering longer than necessary. "You could have been killed." Faith met his gaze steadily. "So could you. Every time you went into that water." Something shifted in Isaac's expression, a softening, a surrender to a truth he could no longer deny. "Faith," he began, his voice lower, more intimate than she'd ever heard it. "Boss." Tom's call interrupted whatever Isaac had been about to say. "We need to head back. Lights fading and the horses are getting restless." Isaac closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. Then he stood, offering Faith his hand. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice once again controlled, professional. Faith nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. But as their fingers intertwined, she felt the tremor that ran through him, the reluctance with which he released her hand once she was steady. The ride back to the ranch was conducted mostly in silence, each of them lost in thoughts of what had almost happened both in the flood and in the moment after their rescue. By the time they reached Whiskey River, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Isaac insisted Faith return to the main house rather than her cabin, a suggestion she was too exhausted and cold to argue against. He sent one of the hands to build up the fire while he saw to the horses, and by the time he entered, Faith had changed into dry clothing, once again borrowing one of his mother's dresses, and was huddled near the hearth, a blanket around her shoulders despite the warmth of the blaze. Isaac had changed as well, his wet clothes replaced by dry ones, his hair still damp from being toweled dry. He crossed to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, bringing one to Faith. "Medicinal," he explained at her questioning look. "For the chill." Faith accepted the glass but set it aside without drinking. "The yearling," she asked. "Fine," Isaac assured her, taking a seat in the chair opposite hers. "All 7 are safe in the barn, none the worse for their adventure." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "You're quite remarkable, Faith Fairchild." The quiet admiration in his voice sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "I only did what needed to be done," she demurred. "No," Isaac shook his head. "You did what no other woman I've known would even consider attempting. What few men would have had the courage to try." He set his glass down, leaning forward. "When I saw you go under," he trailed off, his expression haunted by the memory. "But I didn't," Faith reminded him gently. "You were there." "I almost wasn't." Isaac's voice was raw with emotion. "If anything had happened to you." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The depth of feeling in his eyes said everything his words couldn't express. Faith's heart beat faster. "Isaac," she said softly, a question and an invitation in the simple utterance of his name. He rose from his chair and crossed to her, kneeling beside her seat. Without a word, he took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms. "I've been fighting this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fighting you. From the moment you arrived, challenging everything I thought I knew about my life, my ranch, myself." Faith's breath caught in her throat. "And now?" she asked. Isaac's eyes, usually so guarded, were open to her now, revealing depths of emotion she'd only glimpsed before. "Now I'm tired of fighting," he said simply. "Tired of denying what I feel when I look at you, when I hear your voice, when I see your courage and your kindness." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached up to cup her cheek in his palm. Faith leaned into the touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Tell me to stop," Isaac whispered, his face now inches from hers. "Tell me I'm wrong about what's happening between us." Instead of answering with words, Faith closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Isaac's control shattered. His arms went around her, pulling her closer, his mouth moving against hers with a hunger that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things," he murmured, though his arms remained firmly around her. Faith smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the scar that marked his face. "Life is complicated, Isaac. But some complications are worth embracing." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You should rest," he said reluctantly. "You've been through an ordeal today." Faith nodded, knowing he was right, yet loath to end this moment between them. "Will you?" She hesitated. "Will you stay with me? Just to talk, to be near. I find I'm not ready to be alone just yet." Isaac's expression softened with understanding. "I'll stay as long as you need me." They moved to the sofa, where Faith curled against Isaac's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. They talked quietly for hours about the ranch, about their pasts, about the uncertain future that lay before them. And when Faith finally drifted to sleep, exhausted from the day's events, Isaac continued to hold her, watching the firelight play across her features, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought Samuel Fairchild's daughter into his life and, against all odds, into his heart. The days that followed brought changes to Whiskey River Ranch, subtle at first, then increasingly evident to anyone with eyes to see. Isaac and Faith continued their work with Shadow, whose progress under their combined approach was remarkable. By the end of the second week after the storm, the stallion was accepting a saddle without protest, and Isaac had even mounted him briefly in the corral, with Faith standing by as a reassuring presence for both man and horse. But it was the change in Isaac himself that drew the most notice from the ranch hands. The harsh, solitary figure who had ruled Whiskey River with grim efficiency was giving way to a man who occasionally smiled, who listened more readily to suggestions, who even joined the evening meal in the cookhouse more often than not, usually with Faith at his side. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tom remarked to Hank as they watched Isaac and Faith walking back from the corrals one evening, their heads bent close in conversation. "Boss actually looks happy." Hank nodded sagely. "Miss Fairchild's got a way about her. Reminds me of springtime after a hard winter, brings life back to places you thought were dead for good." Not everyone was pleased by the developing relationship, however. When Isaac's lawyer finally arrived from Denver, nearly 3 weeks after Faith's initial appearance at the ranch, the news he brought cast a shadow over the fragile happiness that had been building. "The partnership agreement is valid," the lawyer, a portly man named Simmons, informed Isaac as they sat in the study of the main house. "Samuel Fairchild did indeed convert his loan to an ownership stake. The documentation is all in order." Isaac's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Faith spoke up from her position by the window. "What exactly does the agreement stipulate, Mr. Simmons?" The lawyer adjusted his spectacles and consulted his notes. "Miss Fairchild is entitled to 20% ownership of Whiskey River Ranch, with proportional share of profits and a voice in major decisions affecting the property." He glanced between Isaac and Faith. "It's a silent partnership, meaning day-to-day operations remain entirely under Mr. Yates's control, but significant changes, such as selling off portions of land, major expansions, or dissolution of the business, would require Miss Fairchild's consent." Isaac stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace and back. "And if I wanted to buy out her share?" Faith felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at his words. Despite the closeness that had developed between them, despite the kisses and tender moments shared, Isaac's first instinct was still to sever the connection that had brought her into his life. Simmons coughed uncomfortably. "That would be between you and Miss Fairchild to negotiate, assuming she's willing to sell. The partnership agreement doesn't specify terms for buyout." "I see," Isaac said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for your thoroughness, Simmons. You'll stay for supper before heading back." "That would be much appreciated," the lawyer replied, sensing the tension in the room and clearly eager to escape it. "Perhaps I'll freshen up first." The journey was rather dusty. Once Simmons had left the room, an uncomfortable silence fell between Isaac and Faith. She remained by the window, her back straight, her face composed despite the hurt curling through her chest. "You want to buy me out," she finally said, not a question but a statement of fact. Isaac ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "I didn't say that. You asked what it would take," Faith pointed out. The implication seemed clear enough. Isaac turned to face her fully, his expression troubled. "Faith, you have to understand what this means. This ranch is everything to me. It's my life's work, the only thing I've ever built that mattered." "And you think I want to take that from you?" Faith asked, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "After everything we've shared these past weeks, you still believe I'm some kind of threat to what you've built here?" "No." Isaac moved toward her, stopping just short of reaching for her. "But the situation is complicated. You have a life in Philadelphia, responsibilities there. What happens when you return east? How do we manage a partnership with 1,000 miles between us?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications neither had fully voiced until now. Faith's hands tightened on the windowsill behind her. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "For me to return east?" Isaac's face reflected the conflict raging within him. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for things to be simple, straightforward, but nothing has been simple since the day you arrived, including us." Faith pressed, needing to hear him say it. Especially us, Isaac admitted, the words coming out like a confession. Faith, I care for you more than I thought possible after knowing you such a short time. But I'm a practical man. I have to think about what happens next, what's realistic. Faith felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. And you don't think there's a realistic future where I might stay? Where what we've begun could grow into something permanent? Isaac's eyes widened slightly, as if the possibility hadn't fully crystallized in his mind until she voiced it. You would consider staying? Permanently, I have considered it, Faith replied softly. More with each day that passes. I've found something here that I never had in Philadelphia, a purpose that feels meaningful, work that brings genuine satisfaction, people who value me for who I am, not what social connections I can provide. She took a deep breath. And I've found you, Isaac. A man who challenges me, respects me, and makes me feel more alive than I ever have before. Isaac closed the distance between them then, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. You would give up everything, your home, your society, the comforts of city life for this, he gestured around them. For a life of hard work and uncertainty. For me, Faith met his gaze steadily. I would if that's what you want too, but it has to be your choice as well, Isaac. I won't stay where I'm not truly welcome, not even for 20% of Whiskey River. For a long moment, Isaac simply looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to read the depths of her conviction. Then, slowly, he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest with a gentleness that belied his strength. I've been a fool, he murmured into her hair. So caught up in protecting what I've built that I almost pushed away the best thing that's ever happened to me. Faith's arms went around his waist, the tension in her body easing at his words. Does that mean you're not going to try to buy out my share of the ranch? She felt rather than saw his smile. It means, Faith Fairchild, that I don't want to buy out your share of anything, not the ranch, and certainly not my heart, which I'm afraid you've claimed a considerable portion of already. Faith pulled back just enough to look up at him, her own smile breaking through like sunshine after rain. Only a portion, Mr. Yates. I shall have to work harder then. Isaac's laugh was warm and genuine, a sound she would never tire of hearing. He bent to kiss her, a tender affirmation of feelings too new and precious to fully articulate yet. There's another option, he said when they broke apart. One I hadn't considered until now. Faith raised an eyebrow questioningly. Instead of me buying out your share, Isaac explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she'd never heard before, we could make the partnership more comprehensive. Faith's heart began to race as she understood his meaning. Are you proposing a business merger, Mr. Yates? Isaac's hands tightened on her waist. I'm proposing whatever it takes to keep you here at Whiskey River, with me. His expression grew serious. I know it's too soon for formal promises. We've known each other barely a month. But I know what I feel, Faith, and it's stronger and more certain than anything I've felt since before the war. Faith reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar that had become dear to her. It's not too soon to know your own heart, she said softly. And mine is telling me that what we've found here is rare and worth fighting for, even if that means fighting your stubborn pride occasionally. Isaac turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. My stubborn pride is what you like best about me, he teased, the last of the tension between them dissolving. One of many things, Faith corrected with a smile. Though I'm partial to your way with horses, your honesty, and the fact that you're quite handsome when you're not scowling. Which hasn't been often until recently, Isaac acknowledged ruefully. Then, more seriously, stay, Faith, stay and help me make Whiskey River everything it could be, everything your father saw when he invested in this place in me. Faith's answer was in her eyes, in the way she rose on tiptoe to kiss him again, in the promise of her body yielding to his embrace. But she gave him words as well, words that sealed their agreement more surely than any legal document could have done. "I'll stay," she whispered against his lips. "For the ranch, for the horses, especially for Shadow, who still needs both of us. But mostly, Isaac Yates, I'll stay for you." The summer of 1876 passed in a blur of activity at Whiskey River Ranch. Faith moved from the small foreman's cabin into the main house, occupying a room across the hall from Isaac's, a concession to propriety that fooled no one but maintained appearances, until more formal arrangements could be made. Together, they completed Shadow's training. By mid-July, Isaac was riding the stallion regularly, their mutual trust evident in the fluid way horse and rider moved together. Faith watched their progress with pride, knowing that what they had achieved with the once wild stallion was symbolic of the changes Isaac himself had undergone. In August, Isaac took Faith to Denver, where they were married in a simple ceremony attended by a few trusted friends from neighboring ranches, and a telegram of congratulations from Faith's aunt in Philadelphia, the only family she had left. Upon their return to Whiskey River, the ranch hands organized an impromptu celebration, complete with a fiddle player brought in from Cripple Creek and enough food and drink to satisfy even Hank's exacting standards. As the night wore on, Faith found a moment of quiet on the porch of what was now truly their home, gazing out at the land that had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. The sound of boots on the wooden boards announced Isaac's approach before his arms slipped around her waist from behind. "Tired of the festivities already, Mrs. Yates," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Faith leaned back into his embrace, savoring the still new sensation of being held by her husband. "Just taking a moment to appreciate everything. It's been quite a summer." Isaac chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest against her back. "That's one way to put it. 4 months ago, I was a confirmed bachelor with a reputation for breaking horses and terrifying ranch hands. Now I'm a married man who talks to stallions and occasionally smiles in public. The change has been noted." "For the better, I hope," Faith said, turning in his arms to face him. Isaac's expression softened as he looked down at her, the love in his eyes unhidden now that he had finally stopped fighting it, for the better in every possible way. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Tom says the men are calling you the horse whisperer's wife. Seems they think you've tamed more than just Shadow." Faith's lips curved in a mischievous smile. "Have I tamed the great Isaac Yates, then? Should I be concerned you've lost your edge?" "Hardly," Isaac replied, drawing her closer. "Ask anyone who's tried to cheat you at the market in town, or the banker who suggested you didn't understand ranch finances well enough to manage our accounts. You haven't tamed me, Faith. You've reminded me that strength doesn't always have to mean harshness." Faith reached up to trace the line of his jaw, marveling at how this stern face had become so beloved to her. "Your mother would be proud of what you've built here," she said softly. "Not just the ranch, but the life, the community." Isaac caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "She would have loved you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Almost as much as I do." From inside the house came the sounds of laughter and music, a celebration of new beginnings and shared futures. But on the porch, in the circle of her husband's arms, Faith found a quieter joy, the deep satisfaction of having found where she truly belonged, with a man whose wild heart had finally found its match in her steady patience. "Come back inside," Isaac suggested after a moment. "I believe I promised you a dance, and Tom has been telling everyone how light on your feet you are." Faith laughed, allowing him to lead her toward the door. One dance, then, but save your strength, Mr. Yates. The night is young, and we have much more interesting ways to celebrate when our guests have gone. Isaac's eyes darkened with promise as he pulled her close for a brief, searing kiss. I'm counting on it, Mrs. Yates. I'm counting on it. As they rejoined the festivities, Faith caught sight of Shadow in the nearest corral, his dark form silhouetted against the moonlit landscape. The stallion stood with his head high, alert but peaceful, no longer fighting the boundaries that had once seemed like a prison to his wild spirit. Like Isaac, he had learned that sometimes what appears to be a constraint can actually be a gateway to something better, a partnership built on trust and mutual respect, a freedom deeper than mere independence. And as Faith took her husband's hand for their promised dance, she knew that what they had built together at Whiskey River was just the beginning. The harsh cowboy who broke horses had indeed been tamed by a woman's steady patience, but in the taming, both had found something neither had expected: not just love, but a shared purpose, a common vision, and the promise of a future richer than either could have imagined alone.